He had eaten in the finest restaurants on 3 continents, surrounded by silver cutlery and staff trained to anticipate his every word before he spoke it, and yet nothing tasted like anything at all. Until the night a woman with flour on her sleeves and fire in her eyes changed the rest of his life. But behind the warmth of that story, something darker was already moving in the shadows of his world, something none of them could see coming. Not yet. This is the story of Kelechi Obi, a man who built an empire from nothing and lost his appetite for living somewhere along the way, and Chiamaka Eze, the woman who reminded him what it meant to actually taste something again, before the two of them discovered exactly how much it would cost them both. Kelechi Obi was 38 years old the year he was named one of the wealthiest self-made businessmen in the country. He owned real estate across 3 cities, a logistics company that moved goods across the entire region, and a penthouse apartment so large that most of its rooms had never once been used. From the outside, his life looked like the kind of success story young men are told to chase their whole lives. From the inside, it felt like a house with all the lights on and nobody home. He worked 18-hour days, not because he needed the money anymore, but because stillness had started to feel unbearable, and food, once one of the few pleasures he still allowed himself, had become just another task his assistant scheduled between meetings. What almost nobody around him knew, what he kept buried beneath the calm authority he wore like a second suit, was that Kelechi had spent the last 2 years fighting off a hostile takeover attempt from a man he had once called a friend and business partner, a man named Chiamaka Eze, who had quietly been buying up shares in Kelechi's company through companies that did not carry his name. It was a war being fought in boardrooms and lawyers' offices, invisible to the public, and it had cost Kelechi more sleep than any of his wealth could ever repay him for. He told no one about it, not because he did not trust anyone, but because he had learned long ago that in his world, admitting weakness was the fastest way to invite more of it. That was how, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, his assistant booked him a table at a small restaurant he had never heard of, tucked into a quiet street far from the city center, run by a chef whose name kept coming up in conversations he only half listened to. He arrived expecting nothing, the way a man arrives at most things after he has already had everything. He left 2 hours later unable to stop thinking about a single plate of food, and even more unable to stop thinking about the woman who had walked out from the kitchen, still in her apron, to ask him personally whether the meal had been good. Chiamaka Eze had not built her restaurant with anyone's money but her own, and she had not built it easily. She had spent years working in kitchens where she was underestimated, overlooked, and occasionally outright dismissed by men who assumed a woman's place was somewhere other than behind the stove giving orders. She had saved for nearly a decade before she was able to open a space of her own, small and unglamorous on the outside, but inside it, every single dish carried a kind of honesty that could not be bought or faked. She did not know who Kelechi Obi was when he walked in that evening. She only knew that he had eaten every bite on his plate slower than anyone she had served in months, and something about that told her more than any 5-star review ever could. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Each time, he told himself it was simply because the food was good, and each time he stayed a little longer than the meal required, talking with Chiamaka about nothing in particular, about her years of struggle in kitchens that never wanted her there, about his own years of building something enormous while quietly starving for something he could not name. Neither of them called it what it was becoming. Not yet. He was a man used to negotiating deals worth more money than her restaurant would make in a lifetime, and she was a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust men who arrived with more wealth and patience. But something between them kept insisting on growing anyway, in the small, unremarkable way real things often do, without announcement, without warning. What Kelechi did not tell Chiamaka, not in those early weeks, was that the timing of his sudden appetite for her cooking was not entirely a coincidence. His assistant had chosen that restaurant not at random, but because Chiamaka Eze's wife had been overheard recommending it at a dinner party weeks earlier, and Kelechi, exhausted from months of watching his own company slip through his fingers, had simply wanted one evening where nobody in the room knew his name or wanted anything from him. He got far more than an evening of peace. He got a woman who, without knowing a single thing about the war he was fighting, made him feel like a man again instead of a target. It was not without difficulty. Kelechi's world was full of people who assumed his wealth, entitled him to certain kinds of company, certain kinds of relationships, certain kinds of women who understood how to move through the rooms he moved through. When word eventually spread that he had been spending his evenings at a modest restaurant owned by a woman with no interest in his money or his name, some of the people around him did not hide their disapproval. His own mother, a woman who had watched her son build his fortune brick by brick, worried aloud that Chiamaka was drawn to his wealth rather than to him, unable to imagine that her son could be loved simply for the man he actually was underneath all of it. What she did not say out loud, though Kelechi suspected she thought it, was that in the middle of a boardroom war for his company, a new woman appearing in his life at exactly the wrong moment looked, to a careful and suspicious mind, like exactly the kind of distraction an enemy might arrange on purpose. Before we go further into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what happens next. Chiamaka faced her own version of doubt. Friends warned her that men like Kelechi Obi eventually returned to the world they came from, that a chef with flour permanently under her fingernails did not belong beside a man who could buy an entire city block without checking his account balance first. She had built her restaurant on nothing but her own two hands, and she was not willing to become a footnote in someone else's story. A temporary curiosity, a wealthy man grew tired of once the novelty wore off. She almost stopped serving him altogether one evening, almost told her staff to hand his table to someone else, until he showed up not for dinner, but simply to ask her, plainly and without any of his usual composure, whether she felt what he had been feeling for months. What neither of them yet understood was that their growing closeness had already been noticed by someone with far more reason to worry about it than either Kelechi's mother or Chiamaka's friends. Emeka Yuba, watching his old friend's every move through people paid to watch it for him, had just learned exactly who Kelechi Obi had been quietly falling for. And a man fighting to take an empire away from someone he once called a brother does not simply ignore a new weakness when he finds one. He studies it. He waits. And when the moment is right, he uses it.